countering the dark side of urban legends. The city was alive with whispers. Tales of shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, of spectral hands reaching out from the darkness, of eyes watching from unseen corners. Urban legends had always been a source of curiosity, a thrill for those who sought to challenge the unknown. But some stories are not just myths, they are warnings. James had always been a skeptic. A journalist for a local online magazine, he made a living debunking supernatural claims. He had traveled across the country, exposing fraudulent psychics, revealing haunted houses as hoaxes, and proving that the supernatural was nothing more than the product of human imagination. When he heard about the infamous Crimson Woman, he saw an opportunity. According to the legend, she was a vengeful spirit that appeared in the reflection of those who dared to mock her existence. The unlucky ones who saw her red-veiled face in the mirror would disappear without a trace. Most believed it to be just another ghost story, something told to scare children or keep people away from the abandoned parts of the city. But the reports were consistent, too consistent to be easily dismissed. Determined to prove the legend false, James decided to investigate. After weeks of research, he discovered that the tale of the Crimson Woman originated from an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for over a decade after a string of mysterious disappearances. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about eerie figures in the windows, lights flickering inside despite there being no electricity, and strange sounds echoing in the dead of night. James dismissed their fears as superstition. He had heard countless similar accounts in his career, and every time he had managed to find a logical explanation. This would be no different. On a cold November night, he packed his camera, flashlight, and notebook and made his way to the building. As he approached, the towering structure loomed over him like a silent sentinel. The air was thick with decay, and the wind howled through the broken windows like a mournful wail. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the rusted front door and stepping inside. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols, hastily scrawled in what looked like dried blood. The floor was littered with debris, shattered glass, old furniture, and personal belongings left behind in a hurry. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic. James set up his camera, positioning it in front of a large, broken mirror in what used to be the building's lobby. This was the mirror where, according to legend, the Crimson Woman revealed herself. With a smirk, he turned on the recording and stared into the fractured glass. "All right, let's get this over with," he said mockingly. "Crimson Woman, show yourself. Prove to me that you exist." Silence. Nothing happened. The only sound was the steady hum of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old building settling. James sighed, shaking his head. "Just as I thought. Another baseless myth." He reached for his camera, but as his fingers brushed against the device, he noticed something. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. His own face stared back at him, but it was off. His expression was too rigid, his eyes too wide. And then he saw her. A woman shrouded in crimson silk stood behind him, barely visible through the cracked surface. Her veil shifted as if moved by an invisible breath, revealing lips twisted into an unnatural smile. James spun around, nothing. The room was empty. But when he turned back to the mirror, his reflection was gone. In its place, the woman now faced him directly. The veil lifted slightly, and a whisper filled the room, slithering into his ears like a serpent. "You called. Now you stay." Panic surged through him as the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and his heartbeat thundered in his ears. The camera began to glitch, the screen flickering violently before shutting off completely. Then the whispers started. They came from all directions, soft, insidious murmurs crawling along the walls, rising and falling like a dreadful chant. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. The light flickered, and shadows stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that moved on their own. James tried to move, but his body was frozen in place. His limbs felt as if they were bound by invisible chains, his muscles locked in a paralyzing grip of fear. The woman's hand, pale and skeletal, emerged from the mirror, reaching toward him. With a desperate effort, he forced himself to move, stumbling backward until he crashed into a rotten wooden counter. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. And yet, the mirror told a different story. The Crimson Woman stepped closer, her veil now drifting away entirely, revealing a face contorted in agony. Her eyes were hollow voids, endless pits of darkness that seemed to pull him in. James let out a strangled cry as an unseen force yanked him forward, dragging him toward the mirror. He clawed at the floor, his fingers scraping against the cold, hard surface, but it was no use. A scream that did not belong to him filled the air, high-pitched, inhuman, and filled with despair. From the shadows, figures emerged. Distorted bodies, elongated limbs, eyeless faces twisted in silent agony. They reached for him, their touch like ice, their presence suffocating. James screamed as his fingers met the mirror's surface. Not hard glass, but something viscous, like a liquid membrane. His hand sank into it, and before he could pull away, the mirror stretched like elastic, consuming his arms, then his shoulders, then his chest. His screams became muffled as his head was swallowed whole, the last thing he saw being the crimson woman's twisted, smiling face. Darkness consumed him. But it was not death. James awoke to an eerie silence. His body felt weightless, his movements sluggish as if he were submerged in water. The world around him was an endless, mirrored abyss, fractured reflections of himself stretching in every direction. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His voice was stolen, his breath non-existent. In the distance he saw figures. Distorted, disjointed, moving unnaturally. Other victims, trapped within the mirror world, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in silent horror. Some reached for him, their hands vanishing into the glassy surface before them, unable to break free. Then he saw her again. The crimson woman stood at the center of this nightmare, her veil no longer covering her grotesque face. Her mouth twisted into a knowing smile as she raised a hand, gesturing toward him. James felt an invisible force pulling him closer, his limbs beyond his control. He realized the truth too late. He was now part of the legend. And soon, someone else would take his place.